They said he had everything: wealth, power, and a mansion on the hill that overlooked the whole town. But behind the polished walls and glittering chandeliers, his sick wife lay shivering with fever, locked away like an animal in the cold, damp stable. No one in town dared to ask why. No one had the courage to challenge him. No one, except the one creature he never noticed. A white horse. Silent. Watchful. Loyal. And when the truth finally came out, it wasn't the millionaire's money that saved her life, it was the horse's unshakable heart. The town of Willow Creek looked golden in the late afternoon sun. Dusty roads glimmered as wagon wheels turned lazily, and children's laughter floated across the square. On the far edge of town, rising above fields of swaying wheat, stood the largest estate anyone had ever seen, an opulent mansion of stone and glass built by the town's most powerful man, Charles Whitmore. Charles was a man of immense fortune, the kind who commanded silence simply by entering a room. His businesses stretched across railroads, mines, and banks. Every coin in Willow Creek seemed to pass through his fingers at one point or another. He was admired by some, feared by most, and envied by all. From the outside, he had everything a man could want. But behind the iron gates and marble pillars, not everything glittered. In a small, dimly lit chamber at the back of the mansion lived Evelyn, Charles's wife. She was once the radiant beauty of the county fairs, a woman known for her grace, her laughter, her kindness that spilled into every room she entered. But illness had crept upon her, quietly at first, a cough here, a weakness in the mornings. Soon, her body had grown frail, her strength fading day by day. The townsfolk rarely saw her anymore. Some whispered that Charles was paying the best doctors, sparing no expense to nurse her back to health. Others doubted it, saying Charles's ambition left no space for tenderness. But no one knew for sure. Charles never let anyone close enough to find out. What Evelyn had, however, was one companion who never left her side, a horse. In the wide pastures behind the estate lived a white stallion named Valor. He wasn't just any horse, he was Evelyn's. Charles had bought him years ago, when their marriage was still young and gilded with romance. She had chosen his name herself, whispering Valor, because courage is more beautiful than gold. The horse grew into a majestic creature, his coat shining like snow, his mane flowing with every step. Where Evelyn went, Valor followed, whether across grassy meadows or down quiet forest trails. But as Evelyn's health declined, she rode less and less, until finally she could no longer mount his saddle. Still, Valor remained near. He paced the fence whenever her window opened, snorted softly whenever she coughed, and lowered his head whenever she walked slowly to the stable. Though words never passed between them, their bond was undeniable. He was her sentinel, her silent confidant, her only witness in the long, lonely days. From the town's edge, people often saw the strange picture, the mighty stallion waiting at the pasture's edge for hours, ears flicking toward the mansion windows. Strange, some muttered. That horse seems to love her more than her husband does. But no one dared say such words aloud where Charles Whitmore could hear them. Inside the mansion, Evelyn's world was shrinking. Each day felt quieter than the last. Servants moved carefully around her, fearful of Charles's stern commands not to speak more than necessary. He visited her rarely, always with a cool detachment, as though she were another business contract rather than his wife. Yet Evelyn tried to hold on to the little joys she had left. When the sunlight spilled across her sheets, she whispered prayers of gratitude. When Valor neighed outside, she smiled faintly, her thin hands pressing to the window pane. And when she could muster the strength, she would slip a shawl over her shoulders and make her way, step by step, down to the stable. Valor always greeted her with a low, trembling nicker, brushing his muzzle against her shoulder as though afraid she might vanish if he pressed too hard. She would laugh softly, stroking his neck, leaning into his warmth. In those quiet moments, the world outside, the wealth, the power, the coldness of her marriage, seemed to dissolve. There was only Evelyn, frail yet gentle, and the horse who refused to abandon her. The townsfolk carried on with their lives, unaware of how fragile hers had become. To them, the Whitmores were untouchable, their mansion a fortress of prosperity. Yet, in truth, Evelyn's life was narrowing to a single thread of hope, that Valor's quiet loyalty might keep her spirit from breaking. And though no one knew it then, this bond, this simple love between a sick woman and her horse, would one day expose a truth so dark it would shake the whole town. The autumn air turned sharp in Willow Creek. Leaves swirled across the cobblestone drive as servants hurried about the Whitmore estate, keeping their heads low. The mansion was preparing for one of Charles Whitmore's lavish gatherings, an evening of wealthy investors, polished crystal, and endless toasts to his growing empire. But while the chandeliers were being polished and the wine uncorked, Evelyn's health slipped further into shadow. Fever burned her skin, her breath shallow and ragged. She had begged Charles days earlier for a doctor, her voice trembling, but he had dismissed her with a flick of his hand. "You exaggerate, Evelyn. You always have. I can't waste resources chasing every ache and cough." Waste. That was the word he used, as if her life could be measured against his ledger books. The night of the party, Evelyn tried to rest in her chamber, but the echo of laughter and music below made her head pound. The scent of roasted meats drifted under her door, sickening her stomach. She pressed her hand to her chest, whispering Valor's name in her mind, wishing for the comfort of his presence. Her door creaked open, not by a gentle hand, but with the sharp push of Charles himself. He stood there in his black suit, his tie crisp, his face hard. His eyes scanned her frail figure on the bed, and something colder than indifference passed across them. "You can't stay up here," he said flatly. Evelyn blinked, weakly lifting her head. What do you mean?" "I can't have you moaning and coughing above the ballroom. People will hear. Investors don't come to Willow Creek to see sickness. They come for strength, for proof that this house is as solid as the man who built it." Her lips parted in disbelief. "Charles. I'm your wife. You are a liability," he snapped. "I won't have whispers of weakness in my home." Before she could protest, Charles motioned to two servants hovering in the hall. Fear lined their faces, they didn't dare question him. He ordered them to lift Evelyn, fragile as she was, from her bed. She tried to resist, weak hands clutching the sheets, but the fever had drained her body of all strength. Her pleas dissolved into the rustle of fabric as she was carried through the halls. Down the grand staircase, past the glittering guests who gasped behind their wine glasses, out through the back door into the biting night air, Evelyn was borne like a secret to be hidden. The servants trembled as they obeyed, knowing they were complicit in a cruelty they could not stop. The stable door groaned open. The smell of hay and earth filled her lungs as they set her down on a pile of straw in an empty stall. Charles stepped in, his polished shoes crunching against the dirt floor. "This is where you'll stay until the party is over," he declared coldly. "No one will hear you here. No one will see you." "Charles, please," her voice was hoarse, nearly broken. "It's freezing. I can't." "You'll survive," he cut her off. "If you don't, then perhaps it was simply your time." With a nod, he turned sharply and left, slamming the stable door behind him. The echo rattled the beams as if sealing a tomb. Evelyn curled into herself, shivering violently. The cold gnawed at her fevered body. Each breath burned in her lungs. The sound of music and laughter drifted faintly from the mansion, a grotesque reminder that her suffering was less than a footnote in her husband's grand performance. And then, she heard it. A low, steady nicker. Valor. The white stallion stood in the stall beside her, his eyes glowing softly in the lantern light. He pressed against the wooden partition, his breath warm against her cheek. She reached out with trembling fingers, brushing his muzzle. Tears blurred her vision, spilling hot down her pale face. You stayed," she whispered. Valor pawed the ground, restless, sensing her pain. He nudged the partition again and again, as though furious at the barrier between them. Evelyn closed her eyes, her weak body leaning toward his warmth, clinging to the only comfort left to her. Hours crawled by. The party roared on, but in the stable the air grew colder, the night darker. Evelyn's breaths came shallow and slow. At times she thought she might not wake again. But every time her eyes fluttered, she found Valor still there, watching her, refusing to rest. And it was in that frozen, fevered silence that something shifted, something Charles Whitmore could never have anticipated. For while he reveled in his triumph upstairs, toasting his empire, the bond between his wife and her horse deepened into something unbreakable. Valor was no longer simply a companion. He became her guard, her anchor, the silent witness to her husband's cruelty. And one day soon, the very loyalty that Charles dismissed as meaningless would become the key to his undoing. The stable was quiet after the music from the mansion faded into the night. Evelyn lay curled in the straw, her breaths uneven, her body trembling under the weight of fever. Moonlight filtered through cracks in the wooden beams, striping her pale face in silver. And always, just beyond the stall's partition, stood Valor. The stallion had not moved for hours. His breath clouded in the cold air, his ears flicking at every sound from the mansion, his eyes never leaving the frail woman who whispered his name in her half-conscious state. Each time she coughed, he pawed the ground, restless and frustrated. When she shifted in pain, he pressed his muzzle against the wood, as if to will his strength into her. But Valor was no ordinary horse in spirit. He had grown up beside Evelyn, learning her rhythms, her voice, her silences. He knew when her laughter was genuine, when her steps were heavy, when her touch trembled. And now he knew, more clearly than anything, that she was fading. Something had to be done. When the party ended near midnight, lanterns flickered out across the estate. Guests departed in carriages, their laughter carrying faintly into the night. Charles Whitmore stood on the grand porch, shaking hands with investors, his smile practiced and charming. To him, the night was a success. His empire had grown stronger. His secrets remained hidden. Or so he believed. Inside the stable, Valor struck the wooden partition again. Once. Twice. The beam shuddered under his strength. Evelyn stirred, whispering weakly, "No, Valor, please, rest." But the horse would not. He reared slightly, slamming his weight against the wood until it splintered with a sharp crack. The sound echoed through the rafters like a gunshot. The barrier gave way. Valor stepped into Evelyn's stall, lowering his head to nudge her gently. She gasped weakly, her frail fingers tangling into his mane. Warmth spread between them, the heat of life, of loyalty, of a bond stronger than words. But Valor was not finished. He turned toward the stable door, ears pricked. His muscles quivered as if every instinct screamed for him to act. He stomped his hooves, snorted, and then, suddenly, kicked hard against the door. The wood groaned but held. He kicked again, dust flying from the hinges. Evelyn tried to call out, but her voice broke into a cough. On the third strike, the door split open, crashing against the wall. Cold night air rushed inside. Valor stepped into the courtyard, nostrils flaring. His white coat gleamed under the moon as though lit by fire. He turned his head back, meeting Evelyn's eyes, and for a moment she understood, he wasn't leaving her. He was fighting for her. The mansion stood lit like a fortress across the yard. Servants had begun clearing the remnants of the party, but none noticed the stallion at first. Valor stamped his hooves loudly, neighing so fiercely the sound carried across the grounds like a warning bell. Heads turned. Gasps followed. "What in heaven's name?" cried one servant, clutching a tray of glasses. Valor bolted across the yard, not in madness but in purpose. He stopped at the kitchen door, slamming his hooves against it until startled servants spilled out. His wild neighs echoed through the night, drawing attention, refusing to be ignored. One of the younger maids, Mary, barely 17, froze when she saw his eyes. She had cared for Valor before, brushing his coat, feeding him apples in quiet afternoons. She recognized his distress, the urgency in every stomp and cry. "He's trying to tell us something," she whispered. The others scoffed nervously. "It's just a horse, Mary. Back away before he tramples you." But Mary shook her head. No, he's leading us." Valor reared once more, then turned and galloped back toward the stable, pausing to glance over his shoulder. His muscles quivered, his eyes burned with insistence. Slowly, hesitantly, Mary followed. 2 stable hands trailed behind, muttering in confusion. When they reached the open door of the stable, Mary gasped. There, curled in the straw, lay Evelyn, pale, drenched in fever sweat, shivering violently. Her lips were blue, her breath shallow. "Oh, Lord," Mary cried, dropping to her knees. "Mrs. Whitmore." The stable hands froze, horrified. They had heard rumors of her illness, but never imagined the truth, that their master had left her here, like livestock in the cold. Valor pressed close, lowering his head until his mane brushed Evelyn's cheek. The sight struck Mary's heart like a hammer. "We must fetch the doctor," she shouted. "Quickly!" One stable hand bolted for town, his footsteps pounding against the dirt road. Mary and the other servant wrapped Evelyn in a blanket, trying to lift her frail body. Valor circled them anxiously, his nose nudging Evelyn as if guiding them to be gentle. In that moment, the horse was no longer just an animal. He was the witness, the accuser, the protector. By dawn, word had spread through Willow Creek. The doctor arrived, scandalized at the sight of Evelyn in such a state. Villagers gathered at the edge of the estate, whispers rising like smoke. How could a man of such wealth abandon his wife to a stable? What kind of heart could turn so cold? Charles Whitmore woke late, unaware of the firestorm building outside his gates. He stretched in his silk sheets, satisfied with his night of triumph. But when he stepped onto the balcony, he saw them, the townsfolk, clustered in hushed outrage, their eyes fixed on his estate. And at the center of it all stood Valor, still beside Evelyn, unyielding, his white coat shining in the dawn. The truth was no longer hidden. The horse had made sure of that. And though Charles's voice could silence servants, and his money could sway investors, there was one thing he could not silence, the loyalty of a creature who would not look away. Morning in Willow Creek should have been peaceful. The sun cast long golden beams across the fields, children chased chickens through the dirt lanes, and shopkeepers opened their doors with sleepy smiles. But that morning was different. A crowd had gathered at the iron gates of the Whitmore estate. Farmers, merchants, blacksmiths, mothers with infants, all murmuring in disbelief at the story that spread like wildfire through town. Charles Whitmore locked his sick wife in the stable. She would have died there if not for the horse. It sounded too monstrous to believe. But the doctor's word carried weight, and so did the testimony of Mary, the maid who had witnessed everything with her own eyes. By the time the town bell rang 9 times, half of Willow Creek stood outside those gates. And in the courtyard, the proof stood for all to see. Evelyn, pale and frail, rested in a cot hastily carried from the stable. The doctor bent over her, wiping sweat from her brow, shaking his head at her fragile pulse. And beside her, never moving more than a step away, stood Valor. His body blocked the crowd, his eyes sharp and ears pinned forward, a sentinel who dared anyone to come too close. The image seared itself into the townsfolk's minds, not her husband, not her wealth, not the sprawling mansion, but a horse, white as snow, protecting her with a loyalty no human had shown. At last, Charles emerged from the house. He was dressed immaculately, as always, tailored black suit, polished shoes that clicked sharply against the stone path. His jaw was tight, his eyes cold, but a flicker of unease crossed his face when he saw the crowd. "What is the meaning of this?" he barked, raising a hand. "Why are you all here? Do you have nothing better to do than trespass on private property?" Murmurs rippled. Mary stepped forward, her voice trembling but strong. "We came because of her," she said, gesturing to Evelyn. "Because your wife was left to die in the stable. And if not for Valor, we would never have known." The crowd murmured louder now, outrage mingling with disbelief. Charles's eyes narrowed. "Lies," he spat. "Servant lies. She is weak, yes, but she was never in danger. I put her in the stable because the fresh air helps her breathing. These are medical measures you wouldn't understand." The doctor straightened, his face reddening. "Medical measures? Sir, I have treated patients for 30 years, and never have I seen a doctor prescribe cold straw and horse stench for a fever. If I had not been summoned last night, she would already be dead. Gasps rose. Charles's composure cracked for a moment, his lips tightening into a sneer. "Doctor, be careful. My name carries more weight in this town than yours ever will." But the crowd wasn't listening to him anymore. Their eyes were on Evelyn, her trembling hands clutching Valor's mane, her pale lips forming a faint whisper of gratitude. And then, in a moment no one expected, Valor moved. The stallion stepped forward, hooves striking the cobblestones with authority. He positioned himself directly between Evelyn and Charles. His ears flattened, his muscles rippled. The sight was unmistakable, the horse was protecting her, from her own husband. The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause. "Control that animal," Charles shouted, pointing. "He forgets who owns him." But Valor did not move aside. Instead, he lowered his head, pawed the ground, and released a piercing neigh that rang across the courtyard like a battle cry. It wasn't just noise. It was a verdict. Whispers rose in the crowd. "He's defending her. Even a horse knows the truth. God help us, this man truly did it." Charles's face flushed red with rage. He stepped forward, but Valor reared high, striking the air with hooves that gleamed in the sun. The crowd gasped, some stepping back, but not one blamed the horse. They saw only courage where there should have been cruelty. And then came the twist, the moment that sealed Charles's fate. The stable hands, emboldened by Valor's defiance, spoke out. "We saw it," one cried. "He gave the order himself. He told us to carry her down. We begged to let her stay in bed, but he threatened to cast us out." Another added, "He said she was a liability. That if she died, it was her time." The crowd erupted. Outrage thundered through the air. Men shouted for justice. Women clutched their children tighter, horrified by the heartlessness they had just heard. Charles's mouth opened, searching for words, but every sentence fell dead against the roar of voices. For the first time in his empire, he stood powerless. His wealth could not silence them. His mansion could not shield him. His lies could not compete with the truth the horse had dragged into the light. The sheriff stepped forward, grim-faced. He had stood silent until then, but now his voice rang with authority. "Charles Whitmore, you are under arrest for cruelty and neglect. Whatever power you had in this town, it does not place you above the law." Charles staggered back, his eyes wild. "You can't arrest me. I am the lifeblood of Willow Creek. You'd all starve without me." But even as he protested, the sheriff clasped his wrists in iron cuffs. The sound of the lock clicking shut echoed through the courtyard. The crowd erupted again, not in anger this time, but in vindication. Justice had finally spoken. Through it all, Valor stood tall, his white coat glowing in the morning sun. His head turned toward Evelyn, as if to reassure her that she was safe now, that her suffering had not been in vain. Tears slipped down her cheeks as she whispered, "Thank you, my brave one." It was not a doctor, not a servant, not even the law that had first exposed the truth. It was a horse, a loyal, silent witness who refused to let cruelty hide in the dark. And in that moment, Willow Creek learned something it would never forget: courage can wear many faces, but sometimes, it wears the face of a horse. The days that followed Charles Whitmore's arrest were unlike anything Willow Creek had ever seen. The town, once quiet and deferential to the millionaire's power, now buzzed with whispers and outrage. For decades, Charles had stood untouchable, his wealth shielding him from accountability, his name opening doors and silencing dissent. But no fortress is impenetrable, and his own cruelty had turned the walls of his mansion into a prison of shame. Meanwhile, in the small clinic at the edge of town, Evelyn's fragile body lay beneath a quilt, her breath rising slow but steady. The doctor visited daily, shaking his head in wonder. "It's remarkable," he told the townsfolk gathered outside, "that she survived the night in that stable. Had it not been for the horse's intervention, she surely would have perished. He saved her life as much as any medicine." And so, Valor was no longer just Evelyn's silent companion. He became a figure whispered about in taverns, prayed for in Sunday sermons, and adored by children who drew his likeness in the dirt roads. They called him the guardian of Willow Creek. Evelyn's recovery was slow, but unlike before, she was no longer isolated in cold halls or abandoned to silence. Neighbors came daily to bring food, flowers, and warm blankets. Mary, the young maid who had first followed Valor that night, sat often at her bedside, reading softly from worn books. But it was Valor's presence that gave Evelyn her greatest comfort. Each morning, the white stallion appeared outside the clinic, standing so still it seemed he might turn to marble. His eyes followed her through the window, his ears flicking whenever she coughed. At night, when the lanterns dimmed, he remained by the door, unyielding against the dark. One evening, when Evelyn was strong enough to rise, she stepped outside into the cool twilight. Her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, she made her way slowly to Valor. He lowered his head at once, pressing his muzzle into her hands. Tears welled in her eyes. "You never left me," she whispered. "Not once. When everyone else turned away, you stayed." She buried her face into his mane, the warmth of his body melting the last of the fear she had carried. For the first time in months, Evelyn felt safe. Justice came swiftly. Charles Whitmore was charged not only with cruelty to his wife but also with intimidation of his servants. For years, he had ruled with fear, and now the testimonies poured forth: stable hands who had been silenced, maids who had seen Evelyn's suffering, even investors who admitted they had looked away for the sake of profit. At the courthouse, the crowd pressed shoulder to shoulder, their breath thick with anticipation. When Charles was led in, still dressed in fine clothes though his wrists were bound, the murmur of voices rose like thunder. The trial was short but searing. Witness after witness described the night Evelyn was carried from her bed. Mary's testimony, trembling but unflinching, cut through every lie Charles tried to weave. The doctor's words carried the weight of science and experience. But perhaps the most unforgettable moment came when Valor himself was brought into the square. It had not been the plan, no one intended to bring an animal to court, but the townsfolk demanded it. The stallion walked calmly through the crowd, his mane glinting in the sunlight, his hooves striking with measured rhythm. He stopped near Evelyn, who had been carried in to testify. Without hesitation, he stepped between her and Charles, just as he had that fateful morning. The crowd erupted in a roar of approval. And in that silent gesture, the jury needed no further persuasion. Charles Whitmore was sentenced to years in prison. His empire crumbled, his wealth scattered, his mansion left empty, a monument not to greatness, but to arrogance and cruelty. For Evelyn, life became quieter but infinitely freer. She left the mansion behind, choosing instead a modest cottage near the pastures where Valor could roam freely. With help from the townsfolk, she built a life not of riches, but of dignity. Children often came to visit, eager to hear stories of the horse who saved her. She would sit on her porch, Valor grazing nearby, and tell them gently, "He is proof that loyalty is stronger than fear, and love is stronger than wealth." Mary became like a daughter to her, helping with chores and learning from her wisdom. The young maid who once trembled before her master now walked with her head high, proud of the role she had played in saving Evelyn's life. In spring, the town gathered for a ceremony in the square. A bronze plaque was unveiled, not of Charles or his mansion, but of Valor. The inscription read, "To the guardian who chose loyalty over fear." The crowd cheered, tears shining in their eyes. Evelyn stood beside Valor, her hand resting against his neck, her face radiant with quiet strength. Years later, long after the scandal of Charles Whitmore had faded into the pages of history, one story remained. Parents told it to children at bedtime, preachers wove it into sermons, and travelers carried it to neighboring towns. They told of the millionaire who locked his sick wife in the stable, and the horse who refused to leave her side. They told of how courage does not always come from the powerful, but sometimes from the humble and the silent. And Evelyn herself, when asked why she thought Valor never abandoned her, would simply smile through tears and say, "Because true love does not count the cost. It does not fear the dark. It simply stays." The mansion on the hill still stands, though its windows are shuttered and its halls are empty. Weeds grow through the cobblestones where fine carriages once rolled. It is a hollow shell, a reminder that wealth cannot shield cruelty from the light. But in the fields beyond, under open sky, valor still runs, his mane flowing like a banner of hope, his steps strong and free. And beside him walks a woman who once lay forgotten in straw, now alive, dignified, and unbroken. The people of Willow Creek never forgot the lesson carved into their hearts. It is not wealth, nor power, nor grand houses that prove the worth of a soul. It is loyalty, love, and courage, whether in man or in beast, that shine brightest in the dark.